quiet down. Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Hunter Schwartz. I'm the Dean of the Law School. I think most of you probably know that. And this is now, I think it's our 7th event of our Centennial celebration. And I'm really glad you all are here today. It's my great honor to introduce today's speaker. And I have to say, if she were ruling what I say in the next few moments, she would have me say, the next speaker is Susan Kuo. She's into law. She's not really big on bio stuff. And so I had to prevail upon her. And she immediately sent me like the shortest bio a law professor's ever sent me in my whole life. And she said, but I can make it shorter if you want. And so part of her bio has to include that she doesn't really want me to tell you her bio. So Susan Kuo is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor at the University of South Carolina Joseph F. Rice School of Law. She served as the law school's inaugural Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion and holds the Class of 1969 Chair for Teaching Excellence. She is also an affiliated researcher with the Hazards, Vulnerability, and Resilience Institute, and her scholarship focuses on vulnerability in the context of disaster. Professor Kuo has received the university's highest award for graduate teaching, the university's Social Justice Award, and law school awards for Outstanding Faculty Publication, Best Classroom Teacher, and Outstanding Faculty Member. Professor/Associate Dean Kuo, this is the part she didn't know I was going to include, there's more, was named in a book, one of the 26 most effective law teachers in the United States, in a book that was published in 2013. And she has a special connection with McGeorge. She has, since the inception of our diversity board, she has served on our diversity board. Larry Levine, she discovered, is actually tall, because she had only seen him in diversity board meetings in a little box. And so she had no idea that Larry Levine is tall. In that role, she has been a voice of insight and advocacy and wisdom and a great friend. And so as we were planning our speakers, first of all, Larry could not stop saying we need to have Susan Kuo speak as part of our centennial. And he may have said that like about 323 times. And he is also someone she is also someone I would just choose to spend time with. I regard her as a person I admire and a person that I consider to be a really good friend, not only of the law school, but of me. So if you could join me in welcoming Professor Kuo.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I would like also to thank Dean Hunter Schwartz and Professor Levine for inviting me here today. And also thank you to Monica Lopez for helping to get me here today. And Stacy, you're somewhere online, I think. So thanks also to the Dean and Mrs. Hunter Schwartz for graciously hosting my husband, Ben Means, and me. We have had a fantastic visit to your city and your impressive campus, so thank you so much for having us. Tonight, I aim to share a little about myself in the hope that my presentation will contribute to ongoing efforts to bridge the political divide and promote constructive dialogue in our classrooms and beyond. And I'll start with some personal stories about my experience navigating race in the southeastern United States. Second, I'll share some of what I've learned from facilitating diversity, equity, and inclusion activities. And third, I'll explain how these lessons have impacted my teaching and academic leadership. But one of the interesting things about being Asian American, especially in the South, is that my racial category isn't always up to me. I find out what I am based on how people interact with me. Sometimes, constructively, that means I count as white by default. For example, when I was about 20, I once found myself in the back of a police car. And this was in Memphis, Tennessee. And never mind how I got there, that's another story. Anyway, the reason I mention this is that the police officer was giving me a lift downtown, and she radioed into the precinct. And she reported a dispatch that she was heading west on Poplar. And this is when she cranked her head back, and she gave me an eyeball. And then she said, "With a white female in custody." And this got my attention. So I scooted up to the partition, you know, that divider between the driver and the passenger, like in a cab. And I said, "I didn't know I was white." And she snapped back, "Well, you ain't black." So this is not the first or last time that authority figures have raced me as something other than Asian, although I have been more often identified, I think, in the Southeast as white rather than black, but not always. But here's another example. I began teaching a couple of decades ago, actually upwards of 3 decades ago, and I've taught at a number of law schools, so hopefully this makes it a little harder to identify the school in my anecdote. But I happened to see the school's responses to the annual ABA questionnaire. So this is the yearly report that law schools submit to the American Bar Association for accreditation purposes. And I was surprised to see that I had been listed not as Asian, but as white. And I got to say, although the legal milieu of the legal academic milieu of the early 21st century was certainly more racially nuanced than, say, that of a Tennessee sheriff's office, right, in the mid-1980s, the black-white binary still held sway. Right? If I wasn't black, I had to be white, or vice versa. Notably, I'll share here, too, that I saw that an Arab-American colleague of mine had been added to the other side of the racial tally and listed as black, even though, you know, as a matter of federal racial classification rules that have been around since the mid-1940s, he would have been categorized as white. On a related note, you may have seen the announcements that Arab Americans will be able to choose MENA, M-E-N-A, Middle Eastern or Northern African, from the list of racial and ethnic categories in the next census. Although I have been construed white or black for some purposes, in other settings I am reminded, sometimes abruptly, of my racial identity. For instance, I was born and raised in Kingsport, Tennessee, which is in the foothills of the Appalachians. But you might have already guessed that I grew up somewhere near a holler, right? You know, my accent is East Tennessee, like Dolly Parton's, although you would not mistake me for Dolly. Apparently, it is incongruous for someone who looks like me to sound like me. In fact, many times I've had someone tell me that they were having trouble understanding me because of my impenetrable Chinese accent. Now, yes, if your mental category for an Asian person excludes the possibility of a hills accent, we're in California, a hillbilly accent, then my twang has to map onto something else. And when you stop to think about it, the transformation of one kind of accent into another is pretty fascinating. Or maybe translation is a better word than transformation. So it's a perverse translation that turns English into Mandarin, insisting that I am unintelligible, but not because I sound like a hayseed, but because I sound Chinese. It's an interesting example of how our racial categories are or can be so restrictive and so unconscious that anything that doesn't fit a preconceived notion must be ignored or reshaped. Another memory I have is of a late night talk with a college freshman classmate. I mean, you know, those talks about everything and anything, you know, you're up, they're up, or you start talking and things kind of go from there. And we somehow found ourselves discussing his past dating experience, whom he had dated in high school, what he liked about them. And I recall feeling pretty comfortable with the discussion, as I'd often found myself kind of acting as a makeshift relationship counselor for friends, despite my pretty limited dating experience. But seemingly out of nowhere, my friend segued into the subject of interracial friendships and interracial relationships. And he told me how he, as a white man, hey Darren, could never be close friends with someone like me, an Asian woman, an Asian American woman. And he certainly could never date someone like me. And I remember thinking just for a split second, well, that's wholly agreeable to me because I'm not interested in dating you. But I mean, my second and longer lasting thought was, wait, you can't date me because I'm Asian? Right? You can't even contemplate a close friendship with me? Right? And not because our personalities are incompatible or because I'm frenetic or annoying, but because of my race. So in contrast to my earlier examples, in which my Asian identity was ignored and subsumed into other racial categories, in these later examples, my Asian identity became my most and I guess possibly only salient feature. And these are but a few memories that continue to reaffirm both the invisibility and the hypervisibility of race in my life. Now, for a long time, I thought that my experiences were peculiar to me, just a happenstance of being Asian in the southeastern United States, where the black-white paradigm governs racial classifications and where this binary often shapes how race is understood as a political and a social construct. However, in more recent years, I've come to realize that my experiences navigating neither black nor white, neither foreign nor familiar, neither friend nor foe, my experiences navigating neither are not singular. And although I'm willing to bet that all of us in this room could point to certain social identity traits that define us, I'm also willing to bet that most of us in this room have encountered categories that don't seem to fully represent who we are. And that most of us have experienced the sting of exclusion. And it truly does sting, by the way. To quote an article on the value of belonging at work that was recently published in the Harvard Business Review, exclusion actually hurts. The sensation is akin to physical pain. I see this shared experience, for example, when facilitating group activities that are intended to educate participants about the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So for 4.5 years, I had the privilege of serving as South Carolina Law's first Diversity and Inclusion Dean. And in this role, I worked with many individuals and groups at the law school and beyond. And back then, and still today, I am often asked to lead workshops on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or in today's parlance, what we at South Carolina would describe as inclusive excellence. So I facilitate inclusive excellence training at the law school and with the bench and the bar. And I especially enjoy leading workshops on identity. These training opportunities are intended to help lawyers and law students communicate effectively with people from a diversity of cultures and backgrounds. And the activities highlight social identity categories to promote awareness of their significance, while also revealing commonalities that connect individuals to one another, regardless of the social identity categories the participants find most significant in their own lives. And by facilitating respectful interactions between people with different life experiences, I endeavor to reinforce the values of the legal profession. In one activity, which I adapted from the University of Alabama's Crossroads program, I asked participants to consider how they're defined by various social identity categories, whether that means age, religion, gender identity, military service, race, ethnicity, political ideology, socioeconomic status, or something else. Right? And I begin the activity by positing a variety of open-ended statements for the participants to consider. Each participant then moves to one of the signs that I've affixed throughout the presentation area. And the signs are marked with various social identity categories. And the signs that the participants select correspond to the social identities that resonate most with them in response to each statement. For example, I might say, the part of my identity that I wish I knew more about is blank. Then the participants will move to whatever identity sign fills that blank in for them. So this activity explores identity by encouraging participants to navigate their individual multiple identities, who they are not, right, in response to these prompts. And over the course of about an hour, the participants take the time to think about their own multiple social identities and consider how their identities impact their life experiences. They also learn about the identities of others and how they impact their experiences. And they notice, and perhaps because I draw attention to this fact, that even when they share a particular identity with another, their perspectives may nonetheless be different, right, due to the multiple ways that their other social identities come together to impact their respective lives. For example, when I run this exercise with law students, they all share the same educational status or educational attainment privilege. But thanks to their unique collection of individual identities, they may experience that privilege very differently. So activities like this sometimes come as a surprise to the participants because many people think that conversations about diversity and difference are only about minoritized groups. But these exercises are about all of the participants because inclusion means everyone. Now it's true, some people have experienced more social advantages than others, and I do think it's important to be able to recognize our privileges, but we can all relate to the experience of feeling left out, of feeling forced to find our way in places and situations that were not designed with us in mind. And when that's the case, it is natural to feel defensive, right, to close down, or to shut others out. The workshops that I lead are designed to provide a venue for discussing difference without judgment. The purpose of our conversations is to learn about ourselves and others, and not to debate or even respond to one another. Working with others through these activities has shown me that we all possess multiple social identities and that we're all tasked with navigating our own neithers, right? Neither this nor that. But guiding a group of individuals who understandably possess a diversity of experiences and perspectives through these workshops, it can be challenging. The same is true for teaching a law school class, leading a student organization, leading a law firm, leading a law school, leading a university. What I've learned from facilitating these workshops is that an effective leader creates an environment where people feel safe to be themselves. Effective leaders create environments that encourage interaction and dialogue, even when, or maybe especially when, discussing issues may cause people discomfort or generate disagreement. Effective leaders foster psychological safety for their teams. Now, much of what I know about psychological safety I learned from a good colleague and friend at USC, the other USC on the East Coast, Nathan Strong, so a little shout out to Nathan Strong. The concept of psychological safety is a term that was developed in the organizational sciences literature about 50 years or so ago. And since then, empirical research has demonstrated that psychological safety is an important component of a successful workplace because, and I'm going to quote, it's what allows employees to feel safe at work so as to be able to grow, learn, contribute, and perform effectively. This is what I mean when I say that effective leaders create psychological safety for their teams. And although this concept has been primarily studied in the context of the work environment, psychological safety is an essential condition for group collaboration and learning. As such, the concept has obvious application not only to my workshops, but also the law school classroom, the law school community, and the legal profession more broadly. More specifically, psychological safety is integral to fostering the willingness of individuals to take interpersonal risks and invest their energies into engaging in dialogue. And this is especially important when discussing sensitive or polarizing issues, which can make anyone feel unsettled, vulnerable, or even targeted. As leaders in our institutions, we should work to instill a sense of psychological safety within our communities. So what is it? I'll start by explaining what it isn't. Right? It's not about being polite or civil to each other. Right? It's not about avoiding disagreements with each other. It's not about feeling comfortable. Psychological safety refers to an individual's perception of the consequences of taking an interpersonal risk. The risk, that is, of being seen as ignorant or incompetent or disruptive or disrespectful. In a recent New York Times article addressing psychological safety in the workplace, the author, the reporter, explained that when employees feel safe, they trust that they can admit mistakes. They seek feedback, right? Or know they can even fail without dire consequences. Putting this in an educational context, it's the belief that the learning environment, the law school environment, is safe for risk-taking. You know, most of us, well, let's have this. In a law school environment with high psychological safety, students, faculty, and staff feel safe to take risks around their classmates. They feel safe to take risks around their colleagues. They feel confident that no one's going to embarrass anyone or punish anyone for asking a question or making a mistake or sharing a thought. Most of us are pretty protective of our images, and certainly in this social media world where everybody has a camera phone and someone's always recording something, right, that you're saying, even whether you're the speaker in class, for example, or sitting in class, which can make it very nerve-wracking to say something in class because you know the rest of the class can play it back over and over and over again, right? And I think millennials and Generation Z are particularly sensitive to both the need to cultivate as well as protect their images. And for this reason, when we fear looking stupid or incompetent, we're not going to ask questions. Right? We're not going to seek feedback. If we're worried about being labeled as negative or disruptive, we're not going to be critical about anything. Right? We're not going to exhibit curiosity. We're not going to suggest anything too innovative or too thought-provoking. Right? But when students in a class, colleagues in a workplace, participants in a group DEI exercise feel psychologically safe, they will engage. They will engage with organizational leadership, and they will engage with each other. Because in a psychologically safe environment, you're given the benefit of the doubt, right? Meaning that others will assume good faith and good intention on your part because they know that you're going to assume the same for them. Why is psychological safety an essential condition for effective group collaboration and learning? Studies clearly indicate that when psychological safety is present in a group, there's a higher level of information sharing among the members. Right? Members are more willing to engage in moderate risk-taking. Members learn more from their shared experiences. They show greater creativity in solving problems. They experience greater trust and respect from other members of the group. And they show greater commitment to organizational and institutional objectives. So how do we foster psychological safety, right, in our classrooms and on our teams? Well, there are a few behaviors that we can engage in, right, to foster this psychological safety. I'll give you three. Number one, establish clear guidelines. Number two, cultivate a participatory culture. And number three, respond constructively to enhance learning. Behavior number one, establish clear guidelines. For example, in the context of diversity and inclusion efforts, I have found it helpful to provide definitions of these concepts. I always emphasize that diversity is about a wide range of issues, not just race. Right? And inclusion is about everyone. I mean everyone. Setting that tone can help bring all stakeholders into the conversation. In setting guidelines, you should present yourself as a person who's responsible for helping the group attain its shared goals. As an associate dean, for example, I have the authority and responsibility to make certain decisions, and I strive to be as transparent as I can about what it is I'm hoping to achieve, where I'm seeking input, why I'm seeking that input, what I'm going to do with that input once I get it. When I know that I won't act without majority approval, I say so. When I'm not constrained by a need for consensus, I make that clear from the outset as well. You should also make clear what the stakes are. High stakes, low stakes, no stakes. When facilitating training opportunities, I stress that participants have complete control over what they share and whether to share. In the classroom, I constantly emphasize that asking questions or sharing thoughts is a low-stakes way to contribute and learn. And the only thing on the line is your pride. As an associate dean, I take much the same view when I'm soliciting input. People don't need to have fully fleshed out proposals to spark ideas. For example, South Carolina is seeking to develop revenue-generating programs consistent with our mission. And we have sought ideas from students, faculty, staff, alums. Right? Some proposals are more inventive than others. I still think using the law school as a wedding venue is a great idea, but I lost out on that vote. But the low stakes have been helpful in generating a broad response. And this serves a further useful purpose, right? Which is that everyone has a chance to participate, so that whatever directions are chosen, they won't feel like they've been delivered by administrative fiat, right, without input and consent. Behavior number two, cultivate a participatory culture that values all viewpoints. Be inclusive, be accessible and approachable, invite input. One of my students once told me, and I'm going to quote her, when students perceive a professor to be approachable, human, kind, and genuine, they trust them. When students trust a professor, they inherently feel more included, valued, and engaged. When I served as the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, one of the first things I did was I put together a student task force on diversity and inclusion. Right? The task force was a place for inclusive discussion, and the leadership structure itself created opportunities for inclusion. So in addition to task force leaders, we also had representatives from every single student affinity group based on identity. So this included our political ideology groups, the American Constitution Society, the Federalist Society, our faith-based groups such as the Christian Legal Society, the Jewish Law Students Association, groups based on racial and ethnic identity, BALSA, LALSA, NALSA, ALSA, our law students, Law Students of Color Collective was also part of this group. Our Carolina Equality Alliance, our LGBTQ group was part of this, our Women in Law, our Veterans and Service Members in Law, and of course a representative from our Student Bar Association, kind of as a representative of the community at large. The leadership structure, along with my rule that the group had to make decisions by consensus, was a great way to cultivate a participatory culture that values all viewpoints. Behavior 3, react constructively to enhance learning. For example, express appreciation for well-intentioned input, regardless of whether that input is actually helpful. And be aware of your facial expressions and other physical tells. I can say that rolling your eyes or shaking your head can actually express negativity. And these are things that we might unconsciously do in response to someone's statement. I use a lapel mic while I'm teaching because my voice isn't necessarily loud enough to reach the back of the room. And I recall receiving a text during class from a student I had just called on in class to discuss a case, and I glanced down to see, because I didn't know if it was an emergency, and the student had texted, "Was I wrong? Was that a bad answer? You sighed into the mic." So, oops. So, always be aware of your own physical and verbal tells. You should also step in if team members speak negatively about other team members, and make clear, right, that violations will be addressed, then address them. Right? And don't let discomfort in discussing a particular issue prevent you from responding constructively to something that's said. And heaven forbid, don't let it stop you, or don't let it prompt you to stop someone else from addressing a uncomfortable subject. One way to encourage others to take risks is by demonstrating it in your own leadership. And plus, if you avoid discussing an obvious but touchy issue, others will notice. Right? And your discomfort becomes their discomfort. They may wonder why you're ignoring the obvious. Maybe you don't care. Right? Maybe you think it's not properly a subject of concern for law schools or lawyers. And this will impact your organizational dynamics and may limit what your stakeholders believe to be within the compass of discussion. So psychological safety is not the only ingredient necessary for successful learning or successful leading, but it is crucial for productive discussions, especially on potentially sensitive issues. And the good news is there really are concrete steps we can take to create psychological safety, thereby expanding the range of topics that we can address constructively with others. And by doing so, we not only improve learning outcomes with respect to those topics, but I think we impart a broader civic lesson that participants and team members carry with them. And that is how to engage others in discussions concerning issues that deeply divide us. How to combine curiosity and compassion with conviction. So I titled this talk Navigating Neither because that has been my experience as an Asian American living and working in the Southeast. Not black, not white. Sometimes wondering how I can contribute to my institution and my community, and wondering whether my contributions are even welcome. But I found that by being myself, fully myself, open to knowing my students, open to knowing my colleagues, and wanting them to know me, I can help foster a culture in which the lines of race, religion, ability, sexual orientation, political identity are not so sharply drawn, not so divisive. And to create this culture, I start with that assumption of good faith. And more often than not, that assumption is rewarded. And this approach, I want to suggest, can be used in any situation that requires leadership. What has worked for me in the classroom, what has worked for me in facilitating workshops, has also served me well in my administrative roles. And where I've been most successful, I've shared the navigating duties with others so that we can chart a course together. So I actually like the phrase inclusive excellence and what it represents. Based on my experiences, personal and professional, a leader who fails to create an atmosphere of inclusion is unlikely to achieve other goals. And by contrast, leaders like Dean Hunter Schwartz are excellent, first and foremost, because they know how to create a community in which everyone is welcome. Thank you. I've stunned you. In a hot second. I've really enjoyed even just walking around your campus. I've never seen a squirrel eat an orange, and it's like amazing. But I love the fact that you can also live on campus and like truly just be part of this law school, and in living and in learning. So I mean, that's really, I think, unique. I don't think you see many schools that have these opportunities. So you're very fortunate.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Perfect. As a leader, how do you mitigate situations where there are students or people in collaborative groups that have contradictions, we'll call it, that stem from some sort of personal or emotional background, where they're adamant about their viewpoint and maybe unwilling to listen to the other person?
I think it depends on what the purpose of the conversations, right? If they're to learn from each other, or if they are to debate one another. One of the exercises I always run in one of the seminars I teach on law and social justice, one of the first things I do with them is I run them through an exercise in learning how to disagree, right? And they really take it seriously. Like, they learn to ask these questions, like, can you tell me more, right? Can you give me an example, right? And they're just exploratory questions to slow themselves down, right? But also to learn more about the other position. But I have found, and I can talk more with you offline about ways to do this, because when I have done this over so many decades, and when students start to get in confrontations, you will hear other students say, use the questions, right? Because they're all adhering to a set of rules. Another thing you can do, and I think this is more ordinarily, well, I think you guys are starting to do that here at the law school with the 1L orientation, is kind of you set the rules, right, for conversations. You set the rules for dialogue. And if you can all agree on those rules, that's an easy thing to work back and point your finger at. It's just a reminder to act professionally, and according to the framework that you have been a part of establishing. So those are some suggestions. I'm happy to talk, more specifically, because yours was a very general question that I suspect was that stems from something more specific. Anyone coming to South Carolina to go to the beaches? I guess you have beaches up here too. So we do not have squirrels that eat citrus. So, Darren, thank you for coming out. It's nice to see you. The leader of our diversity board.
Dean Quo, may we ask, why were you in the back of that cop car?
Oh.
Am I the only one wondering?
Let me just say that the other person started it.
Hi, Dinko. This is Tay. I emailed you before.
nice to meet you in person.
Yeah. I kind of want to ask you about kind of being an Asian American. I do feel like we have that model minority title for us, and then sometimes I feel like even though I am a minority, I don't feel that way, or I should kind of give that role to someone maybe that's darker than me, that are culturally not very kind of in tune with America, because I grew up here. Even though I was born in Korea, I've been kind of raised here, so I feel pretty American, even though I'm not. And so I think, in a way, I don't know how to kind of cope with like being a model minority and then, not really being a minority, I guess.
Well, first off, you are American, right? You're Asian, and you're in America, so you're Asian American. I think it sounds almost like as if you feel guilty, right, having the label of minority placed on you. But in truth, the label has been put on you, right? And I don't know that you have control over how other people see you. I think the term model minority has, in my view, a fairly invidious consequence, right? Even if it may be used by some people in an attempt to be positive, I think the consequences are rather pernicious, right? And it places a lot of stress and, frankly, false, assumptions about us as a group, and it also ignores the diversity that we bring to the table. It originally had, I think, popped up with the earlier waves of Asians coming in following the Asian exclusion from this country. And in fact, I suppose one could say that the achievements of the group that came in were relatively good, right? But that was also a select group of people who were allowed in, you can come, not you, that sort of thing that happened. And of course the achievements would be higher because those individuals were coming with greater advantages. But as we have diversified ourselves, as a ethnic or racial population, I think that the world sees that we are as multivaried and multifaceted as any other human being. There's nothing model or not model about us. Right? So I would encourage you not to bear that guilt, because there's so much more that you have to bear that you haven't asked for. So why do you take that on too? I don't. Although I do walk around thinking I'm smarter than everybody else. No, that's not true. So
Hi. Would you say these conversations are easier to have nowadays, or maybe around 2005, 2008, around that time?
nowadays, I think everyone's so sensitized. For me, they're not harder or easier, but I know that the climate that I'm working with is flammable. Right, if that's a fair statement. So, I led a workshop with a group of young lawyers a couple of months ago, and it was a 2-hour workshop, so we really had to like each other because we were stuck with, I think it was maybe 3 hours, but it was pretty long. And I find that there are easier ways of wading into these conversations, and that, for me, is creating that psychological safety. So once that's built, right, those tentative risks that people take, and then to see them rewarded by other people taking risks, I find that to be infectious, and it ends up being positive. So I've never really had a difficult group. I think the most difficult group I had, I was going to walk around, but I realized I need to stay by the mic. The most difficult group I've had was probably a business group. And it might be because it was more diverse within itself, more stratified. It was a group of bankers, but people from the front lines, like the bank tellers, people working the floor, all the way up to people in the corporate office, and including some of the people who were running the bank. And I think that was more difficult, not because people couldn't see eye to eye, but because those on the front lines were initially afraid to speak. Right? Because they were in an atmosphere with someone that they thought could fire them or make a decision about next year's bonus. So I had asked for us to then start splitting into smaller groups to work, and that actually worked, even with different people in the smaller groups, because they felt safer in the small groups, and then having this is a teaching technique, as I know Dean Hunter-Schwartz knows, and then the small groups can then report out to the larger groups, and then the conversation can go from there. So I guess a long answer to your question is, I think the atmosphere is more tense right now, but I think these conversations absolutely can be had, and I think they should be had. And frankly, I think a lot of people want to have them, they just don't know how to have them. And that goes back to our learning how to disagree with each other in a way that's respectful and allows each party to be heard.
Thanks for coming. So you mentioned earlier that in your leadership positions, when you know you have discretion to make maybe a unilateral decision versus needing consensus, that you'll communicate that explicitly to your people on your teams. When you're in that more discretionary space where it's up to you, maybe regardless of the consensus, how, if at all, do you still incorporate your DEI and your inclusion values in that process as well?
Oh, I make sure I listen very carefully to all the stakeholders. I don't ask people as just a make-weight exercise. I ask people because I know so little, right? And everyone working around me knows their areas of expertise way more than I do. So it's very important that I hear the different perspectives. But one thing you can do in the role of the decision maker is that you're hearing from different perspectives that may actually be crosswise with each other. So I think that helps you find your way to the most, I don't know, acceptable answer, or the decision that will get you to where you want to go in the most expedient way or the least damaging way possible. But I always explain how I made the decision as well. So even if I don't go with someone's suggestion, I will always speak with them, and usually first before I announce the decision, and explain why. It's not always a democracy, right? But building consensus is about bringing everybody into the conversation so that you can together, and I think I use the term chart the course. So that people may disagree with how you're doing it, but if they've been part of that conversation, they know that their values or their views or have been taken into account, they're usually okay. And I mean, I have colleagues who will say, well, Susan, I disagreed with you on that one, but I do understand why you chose the way you wanted to go. I actually had one of those by Teams last night after everybody had gone to bed. And so I was trying to explain a decision that I had to make. And with my role, very different from the big dean role, like I have a lot of responsibility and like no power. But for that reason, and many reasons, I do a lot of explaining. And I find that the explaining helps me understand why I've gone that way as well, because it makes me have to unpack my own thinking process so I can detect any bugs in it, hopefully, usually.
Could you give us a little insight into what the learning outcomes were that you sought in the bankers workshop that you mentioned? How did you set it up for them? What were the goals in that context?
Well, that was actually tricky because I wasn't sure what their goals were initially. But they liked it because they brought me back a few times to keep talking with them. So my first goal when I walked in, well, before I came in, I thought, well, we're going to run through some of these activities and we'll see where it goes. But once I walked in and met everybody, right, and learned what everyone did, I realized I was going to have to start shifting things around. So then my initial goal became getting them to know each other. Because it's so important, especially even in a bank, but a small bank where people are working together, that they actually feel like they know their colleague, or that their colleague actually cares about them. You don't have to know every detail about someone, but you have to feel like you can look at that person and be seen, right? Or that they can look at you and see you. So that was my first goal. And that was actually tricky because COVID had more recently hit. It was that fall 2020. And this is when we still thought that those face shields could protect us. And so I'm walking around this room with, luckily, South Carolina was probably on the later receiving end of the onslaught of COVID, so none of us got sick as far as I know. But it was maybe also some of the initial hesitation also came from that fear of being in a room together with about 30 people and, going in and out and around people. Maybe it was all me, I don't know. I was like, I don't know you, and I'm walking around with this facial shield. But I think that you have to be prepared not to be rigid when you work in a law school for a classroom, or if you're facilitating exercises, or if you're leading whatever community group or student group or professional group that you're in charge of. I think you have to be ready to turn on a dime, right? And that comes from being responsive to what is being said around you. And I guess that's probably behavior number 3, respond constructively. And that includes listen to what people are saying to you.
I really don't need the mic. So you clearly are a very upbeat and optimistic person, and this cannot be the last question because I do not want to end on such a note.
Uh-oh.
Are you surprised, given the work you've been doing, that things like equity, inclusion have become bad words and are really under attack and really were sort of vilified for the efforts that you've been so engaged in. And I imagine that you're in a state where it may be very soon that there will be legislation, if it hasn't happened already, banning
It's in the works.
for these sorts of endeavors. And how is someone as upbeat and cheerful as you going to navigate that?
It does not impact my upwards looking feelings or my optimism. I think this is just, to me, in South Carolina, this is being broadcast broadly, so because there is a bill right now in our legislature to limit the use of race or even statements about diversity in our admissions process. There's a reason why we now have a head of inclusive excellence, or why Ben, who's also a faculty member at the law school, is the chair of our Inclusive Excellence Committee, formerly known as our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I mean, it is a dodge, right, in that sense of not using that word, but I find that we don't have to use that word. I mean, I do use that word a lot when I'm talking, but we don't have to use it as a title because the aspirations are still there. It doesn't really matter if you call me Susan or Quo or, whatever. I'm still who I am. So it has not at all tarnished my outlook, and I continue to be asked to give presentations, even by legislative bodies. So I get asked to do all sorts of things. So people still have the goals. It's sort of like when you do the surveys and you have individuals who will say that they don't believe in making admissions decisions based on race, but they do firmly believe in affirmative action. Right? And you get this kind of odd juxtaposition of viewpoints from the same person. I truly don't think, and this is coming from someone who was born and raised in the South, and I live and work in South Carolina, where I'm happily living and working. I truly don't believe that there are many, if any, people out there who, well, okay, there are probably some, but there are not many people who want to do harm to other people on these topics. Right? They just get entrenched in what they think, right, is the reality, right, of the world, when maybe it's their own personal reality. And sometimes having discussions like the identity exercise that I run people through is very eye-opening for people to realize that their reality is very different from somebody else's reality, even if you're both lawyers in the same firm, but your experiences are so different. So I do think, and it's not totally kumbaya, I just think that we understand more about these concepts when we understand more about others. As one of my former students came into my office the other day, he graduated a number of years ago, and he made a statement of, sure is hard to hate on somebody when you know them. Right? And I think that really captures my viewpoint. I just think, all right, let's go. And we do. So thank you for that question, but it really doesn't impact me. I think if you take in these positions as an end to the work that you're doing, then it would bum me out. But I just see it as just more conversation.
Thank you for coming as well. I'm going to be in a meeting in June where I know there will be open hostility by one person, and rather far out. But this person has sent a letter to the group saying, I'm going to call out the lies. I'm going to make the people who have given those lies stand up and hear me out, and I'm not going to be done until I'm finished. This is a homeowners association, folks. You may not have to worry about that yet. But the rules are not covering the civility aspect of what we need, and we've had a civil group up until now. So what are your thoughts? Have you had to deal with that kind of open hostility and, of course, time limits that will have to be applied somehow?
I was going to suggest time limits. Has anyone spoken with this person directly?
That's pending, but a letter went out to every member of the association saying that's what to expect. So there's intimidation
I would recommend, I don't know this person, so I think every approach that I've taken differs depending on who the recipient is of the attention from me. But I would recommend having a direct talk with them beforehand to let them know that you understand that he has strong feelings and you understand kind of the gist of some of those feelings, and that, you know, you are prepared to hear his thoughts at the homeowner association. Well, there's a lot at stake at these things, right? In the homeowner association meeting, to let him know he will be heard, assuming he has a right to be heard. Right? And then let him know he will be heard and he will be given his time, and that, you know, you look forward, right, to having that exchange with him. I think, you know, trying to, and this is not what you're suggesting, but trying to quash, right, or squash his ability to talk, that's also that would negatively impact everybody else in the room, including the people who would want him to be quiet. I don't know if he's a he, who would want them to be quiet. Right? There's nothing like putting a student in their place in class, right, who's been disruptive, that sends a terrible ripple effect to the class, because even the students who are like, finally, right? But they are also afraid then to put something forward because that might happen to them, right? So, yeah. So you already know what you have to do. This person's coming, this person's gonna have their say, but you might think about your procedural rules and also emphasize with all the participants, right, that they must follow the procedural rules and that they will all get their time. But I think letting everybody know what to expect is a good idea, although it might heighten anxiety. It also helps people prepare themselves emotionally. I'm sorry that's happening.
Hi. Thank you very much for coming and speaking on all of these topics. I just wanted to address what you had just mentioned a moment ago regarding the amazement at educational institutions who claim that they do not discriminate, and yet they have admittance policies excluding particular races, who on every other level would otherwise, but for their race, be admitted into that institution. And also I wanted to kind of touch upon the woman who previously stated that she's from an Asian country, I believe it was Korea, and she doesn't quite know how to feel and be Asian and American. And I actually was born in an Asian country, in Taiwan, and I came over when I was 7. So when I first moved to the US, we lived in Reno, Nevada, which at the time only had Caucasians and blacks and just me and my siblings. And so it was very different growing up in that culture. But I think it did definitely toughen me up, but it also taught me at that time that I wasn't white, I wasn't black, I'm other. And it took me years to come to grasp with that, but I wanted to say to this woman that, you know, I have learned to be very confident, and I think that experience, you either sink or swim. So either you grow stronger from that experience, or you let that experience negatively impact you. And for me, it made me stronger in who I am. I'm very proud of my heritage, and I'm proud to be a contributing member of America, whether it's as an Asian, whether it's as an American, or as an Asian American. And I believe that because of my experiences and my background and my particular viewpoint, it contributes to the benefit of all of the groups that I am able to participate in. But I wanted to just end on one other note, which is that I think that Asian Americans historically do not speak up as much as other groups. And I think that that is to our detriment, because we've never culturally been taught by our parents, taught by our cultures, taught by our relatives to speak up. And I know that for myself, I've always been taught, don't say anything, don't rock the boat, don't make anybody feel bad. But it's definitely been to my detriment. I was in I'm in the Inn of Court, and there was a presentation several years ago in which there was a skit where two employers had thought about which employees they could fire because they weren't making the revenue they needed. They had 3 employees, and they needed to fire somebody. One was Caucasian, or one was I believe, Hispanic. One was LGBTQ, and one was an Asian. So they talked about firing the Latino Hispanic person. Then they said, well, no, that would look bad because then there would be an allegation of race discrimination. They talked about firing potentially the LGBTQ employee, and then they said no because then that would be that would potentially run into sex discrimination and sexual orientation discrimination. So then, just off the cuff, well, we might as well just discharge the Asian American. And there was no discussion. There was no thought about that. There was no discussion about that because they knew that that person would be the least likely to raise any issues. And I thought about it at that time, but during discussions, I didn't raise my hand to say something. But in the ensuing years, you know, I've always thought, this is the problem. I'm the problem. You know, maybe that fictional employee would not have said something, but this is my problem. I recognize that that person should say something. So I do think that as a group, Asian Americans do need to let their voices be heard just as loudly as any other group. Thank you again.
Thank you. You know, I think that looking out at the faces in this room and knowing how culturally and ethnically and racially diverse this law school is, I mean, I think that is parcel to why you've come to law school. Many of you have come to law school. Many of you work in law schools, because you understand the importance of advocacy and speaking up for those who can't speak up for themselves. You know, I had originally gone to law school thinking that I was going to become an immigration lawyer and that I was going to go home to Kingsport and help all the peoples that I could in the area. And I didn't fulfill that dream, but I feel like I'm doing a little bit of that now, even in the work that I do here. So there are many ways to get where you want to go. Right? You just have to know what it is you want to achieve, right? And then chart your course to get there. Thank you.
So we have a little bit of business. First of all, this is not something I do very often, but I want to travel back to when in 2013 I told all the law professors and lawyers that Susan Kuo was one of the 26 best law teachers in the United States. I was right, as you now know. So I told you so. That's my first thing.
But you do realize that this man wrote the book.
So that was the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is, I think if you think about our conversation just now and the questions, the psychological safety was created for us in the moment, and the vulnerability that, and I particularly want to acknowledge our students who are vulnerable about their own experiences, how meaningful that is to have a person come to another law school and in a very short time create a space where students could speak their authentic selves. So that's pretty amazing. And then finally, I have to bestow 2 categories of gifts to Dean Kuo. The first one, these are the gifts for you and Ben.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then these are a special set of gifts for your children, because I picked her up at the airport shortly after, I learned from Susan and Ben that there was an expectation when they go home that they come with gifts, and I felt like, oh my God, she's just, she's doing so much, she's only here for a short time. I better help out for that. So this was carefully curated by Cassandra and Judy. And I guess I want to leave with, I haven't done a great job of thanking Judy for her amazing work. it's, I mean, really, she's been with us for like months. What? Last September. Yes, that's a very short time for her to generate a bazillion ideas that have already done things to make the school better, to make our 100th anniversary festivities better. And so, you know, there's a, I mean, like to the level of, I got a picture of her wiping the tables down so you would have nice, clean, lovely tables to enjoy. That is the level of detail at which that she has contributed. So here's your second set of things.
Thank you.
And thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you all. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope that you will not be strangers, and you'll reach out to me if I can help with anything. I'm here for you.
Thank you.